Before the first snow fell on the Eastern Front, millions of men had already vanished, not in battle, but in captivity. What happened to them was so extreme that even officers inside the German military apparatus quietly noted it in their diaries with disbelief. This is not a story of combat. It is a story of what happened after the fighting stopped, and it is far worse than most people know. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, it was the largest military invasion in human history. Within weeks, entire Soviet armies collapsed. The speed of the German advance was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled, cut off, and forced to surrender before they could even grasp what was happening. By the end of 1941 alone, Germany had taken roughly 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war. To put that number in perspective, it was more prisoners than any army had ever captured in such a short period of time in the history of modern warfare. The Wehrmacht, Germany's armed forces, was simply not prepared for this. There had been no serious planning for what to do with millions of captives. Camps were hastily assembled, or, in many cases, not assembled at all. Fields were fenced off with barbed wire. Men were marched for days without food or water. Those who fell behind were shot on the road. But the chaos was not entirely accidental. There was ideology behind it. The Nazi regime had already made clear, before Barbarossa even began, that the war in the East would be fought differently. Soviet soldiers were not to be treated according to the rules established by the Geneva Convention, which Germany had agreed to follow in previous conflicts. Soviet prisoners, in the official view of the Nazi leadership, were not entitled to those protections. This was formalized in a series of directives issued before the invasion. The most important of these was the so-called Commissar Order, issued on June 6, 1941, more than 2 weeks before the invasion began. It ordered German forces to execute all Soviet political officers, known as commissars, upon capture, without trial. These were men whose job was to maintain Communist Party loyalty within Red Army units. Under the order, they were to be shot immediately. The Commissar Order was not a secret whispered among extremists. It was a written military directive distributed through the German officer corps. Some commanders carried it out without hesitation. Others quietly ignored it or found reasons to delay. But even those who refused did not openly challenge the regime. What is striking is that even before a single shot was fired on the Eastern Front, the legal framework that might have protected Soviet prisoners had already been deliberately dismantled by the German High Command. And what followed, in the camps, on the roads, in the occupied territories, was the direct consequence of that decision. Coming up, what life inside the prisoner camps actually looked like, and why the death toll in just the first winter shocked even experienced German military officers. The prisoner camps the Germans established in the Soviet Union in 1941 were, in the vast majority of cases, not camps in any meaningful sense of the word. Many were simply open fields surrounded by wire. There were no barracks, no roofs, no sanitation facilities, no medical care. In some locations, prisoners were held in pits dug into the ground, exposed to wind and rain. The camp at Uman, in what is today central Ukraine, became one of the most documented examples of these early enclosures. Following the encirclement of Soviet forces there in early August 1941, roughly 100,000 prisoners were held in an open quarry. German records, as well as testimonies collected after the war, describe conditions where men fought over scraps of grass and plant roots to avoid starving. Water was scarce. Dysentery spread rapidly. The bodies of those who died were not removed promptly. They lay among the living for days. Uman was not exceptional. It was representative. At Dulag 205 near Stalingrad, at Stalag 352 near Minsk, at dozens of other sites across the occupied Soviet Union, similar conditions existed. The Minsk camp at one point held over 100,000 men in a space designed, if it was designed at all, for a fraction of that number. Starvation was the dominant experience. German military records from the period showed that the official daily food ration allocated to Soviet prisoners was a fraction of what was provided to prisoners from Western Europe. The reasoning given internally was that Soviet prisoners were a burden on supply lines, and that feeding them fully would come at the expense of German troops and the German civilian population. The result was predictable. Men began dying in enormous numbers within weeks of capture. By the time winter arrived in late 1941, And on the Eastern Front, that winter was among the coldest in decades. The situation became catastrophic. Prisoners without shelter, without adequate clothing, without sufficient food, began dying at a rate that even German administrative officials found difficult to process. Reports from camp commandants noted mass deaths occurring daily, sometimes numbering in the thousands in a single location. A report submitted by a German army group in late 1941 noted that the prisoner situation had become, in the author's words, unmanageable, not out of sympathy, but out of concern that the scale of death was creating logistical and administrative problems. Even from that cold, bureaucratic standpoint, the scale was acknowledged as extraordinary. One of the most disturbing aspects of this period is how little intervention occurred from within the German military establishment. There were officers who recorded their discomfort. There were administrators who raised concerns. But the machinery of death that had been set in motion by the regime's ideological directives continued largely without obstruction. What happened next, when disease swept through the camps and German officials began receiving numbers they struggled to explain even to themselves, is where the story becomes even more difficult to account for. The combination of starvation, exposure, and extreme overcrowding created ideal conditions for disease. By the autumn of 1941, typhus had broken out in multiple camps across occupied Soviet territory. Typhus, a disease spread primarily through body lice, moves quickly through populations living in close quarters without hygiene facilities. In the conditions of the German prisoner camps, it was essentially uncontrollable once it began. The German response to the typhus outbreaks illustrates the logic that governed the entire prisoner system. Rather than making efforts to treat the sick or improve conditions to slow the spread, camp authorities in many locations responded by sealing off infected areas entirely, preventing food and water from entering on the grounds that the men inside were already dying. In some documented cases, men who showed signs of illness were separated and shot to prevent further spread. This was not a medical response. It was an extermination response dressed in administrative language. The death tolls from this period are staggering by any measure. German records, which are incomplete and, in some cases, deliberately understated, indicate that by February 1942, approximately 2 million of the 3.3 million Soviet prisoners taken in 1941 had died. That is a mortality rate of roughly 60% in less than 8 months. To put that in historical context, the death rate among Soviet prisoners held by Germany in 1941 was higher than the death rate in many of history's most notorious episodes of mass atrocity. It was not a gradual decline, it was a collapse. Some German military officials, confronted with these numbers, raised concerns, not primarily on moral grounds, but on practical ones. There was a growing realization within parts of the German military economic apparatus that the Soviet prisoners who had died represented a vast pool of potential labor that had been squandered. German war industries were beginning to face labor shortages. The millions of men who had died in the camps might have been put to work. This argument, essentially that the prisoners should have been exploited rather than allowed to die, did lead to some policy adjustments in 1942. Rations were slightly increased in certain camps. Prisoner labor was more systematically organized for industrial and agricultural work. The death rate did decline from its catastrophic 1941 peak, but the shift was driven entirely by German self-interest, and it came too late for the majority of men captured in the first year of the war. But starvation and disease were not the only tools used against Soviet prisoners. In the occupied territories, a different system had taken hold, one that targeted specific groups of men from the moment of capture for reasons that had nothing to do with military necessity. From the beginning of the Eastern Campaign, the German military and security apparatus made clear distinctions between different categories of Soviet prisoners. Not all captured men were treated identically, though the baseline conditions were brutal for almost everyone. Certain groups were singled out for immediate or accelerated death. Jewish soldiers in the Red Army were among the most immediately targeted. Upon capture, men were screened. Those identified as Jewish were typically separated from the general prisoner population and handed over to the SS and Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that operated behind the front lines. What followed was execution, usually within days or hours of capture. This was not a battlefield improvisation. It was a coordinated policy. The Einsatzgruppen operated under orders that designated Jewish Red Army soldiers as a priority target. German military commanders were aware of this. In many cases, their units participated in or facilitated the screening and handover process. Political officers, the commissars targeted by the June 1941 order, faced a similar fate. Identification of a commissar upon capture meant death. The order was explicit and left no room for discretion on the part of individual soldiers. Men were shot in the field, near the front, without any process of review. Beyond these two specifically targeted groups, the prisoner system also created conditions that disproportionately killed men from certain regions and ethnic backgrounds. Soldiers from Central Asia, from the Caucasus, from parts of the Soviet Union that German racial ideology viewed with particular hostility, faced harsher treatment and higher death rates even within the general prisoner population. There was also an ideological effort directed at the prisoner population more broadly. German authorities attempted to recruit captured Soviet soldiers into auxiliary units and propaganda efforts, particularly targeting non-Russian prisoners in an attempt to exploit tensions within the multi-ethnic Soviet state. Some prisoners, driven by desperation or coercion, did collaborate. The majority did not, even when the alternative was continued exposure to the conditions of the camps. The question of collaboration among prisoners is a complex one that historians have examined carefully. The men who did accept German offers of auxiliary service did so under circumstances of extreme duress, facing starvation, illness, and near certain death in the camps. Judgment of those choices requires understanding the conditions under which they were made. What is clear is that the German attempt to fracture Soviet prisoner loyalty had limited success. Despite the catastrophic conditions, despite starvation and disease, and the targeting of specific groups, the prisoner population did not collapse into large-scale cooperation with their captors. That resistance, and what happened to those who openly defied their captors, is a part of this story that is rarely told, and it leads directly to some of the most remarkable individual accounts to survive from this period. Given the conditions, organized resistance among Soviet prisoners was extraordinarily difficult. Men were weakened by starvation, riddled with disease, and under constant armed guard. Escape required not only physical capability, but access to information about the surrounding terrain. In most cases in occupied Soviet territory, prisoners were far from friendly lines, in unfamiliar regions, with local populations who faced severe punishment for aiding escapees. And yet, resistance happened. Underground networks formed inside a number of the larger camps. These were small, secretive groups, usually organized around officers or Communist Party members who had survived the initial screenings. Their activities ranged from sharing information, to hiding men who were scheduled for execution, to planning escapes. The camp at Stalag 1B in East Prussia, now the territory of modern-day Russia, held a significant number of Soviet officers and became a site of documented prisoner organization. Men who had managed to conceal their rank or their political status formed small cells. They gathered intelligence on camp routines, mapped guard positions, and in some cases managed to pass information to the outside. Escapes did occur throughout the war, though successful ones were relatively rare. German authorities maintained a policy of collective punishment. When a prisoner escaped, others in the same barracks or group faced reprisals, up to and including execution. This policy was designed specifically to undermine the social bonds that made organized escape possible. It forced men to weigh their own survival against the certain costs their escape would impose on those left behind. There were mass escape attempts as well. At the Voldenberg camp, Stalag 2D, and at several other locations, coordinated breakout attempts were made. Most were discovered before they could be executed. In some cases, informants within the prisoner population, men who had agreed to report on their fellow prisoners in exchange for better treatment, betrayed the plans. The use of informants was a deliberate German policy. By offering marginal improvements in conditions in exchange for intelligence, camp authorities created pressure within prisoner communities. This did not break those communities entirely. The networks of resistance persisted throughout the war in many locations, but it introduced suspicion and caution that made coordination harder. Among individual acts of resistance, the story of Mikhail Devyatayev stands out as one of the most documented. A Soviet fighter pilot shot down in 1944, Devyatayev was taken to the island of Usedom off the German Baltic coast, a location where German rocket programs were being tested. In February 1945, he and 9 other prisoners seized a German aircraft that was sitting on an airfield used by the camp and flew it to Soviet lines. The flight covered several hundred kilometers. The men had no charts, no direct training on that specific aircraft, and no certainty that Soviet anti-aircraft fire wouldn't bring them down before they could identify themselves. They made it. Devyatayev's account, documented in detail after the war, describes the planning process that took months, the false starts, the near discoveries, and the desperate improvisation of the flight itself. It is one of the few first-person records of life inside a German prisoner facility during this period that survived with enough detail to be independently verified. What makes Devyatayev's case particularly significant is not just the escape itself, but what it demonstrated about the capacity of men under extreme duress to maintain purpose and organization. The planning for the escape had begun not weeks but months in advance. Small acts of observation, noting when guards changed, which aircraft were fueled and which were not, how the airfield perimeter was monitored at different times of day, accumulated over time into a plan that was, against every reasonable expectation, successfully carried out. Devyatayev was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union designation in 1957, more than a decade after the escape. The delay itself, a reflection of the suspicion that continued to surround former prisoners even after the war ended. But the story of Soviet prisoners did not end with liberation. For many of those who survived the German camps and made it back to Soviet territory, another ordeal was waiting, one that very few people outside of Russia know about. When Soviet prisoners were liberated, whether by the advancing Red Army or through the collapse of German administration as the war ended, they did not return to a straightforward welcome. The Soviet system under Stalin had a specific view of men who had been captured by the enemy, and that view was deeply suspicious. Stalin's order, number 270, issued in August 1941, had declared that Soviet soldiers who allowed themselves to be taken prisoner were traitors. The order was explicit. Surrender was not an option. Men who were encircled were to fight to the last, or destroy themselves rather than fall into German hands. Families of soldiers who had been captured were to face penalties, loss of state support, in some cases, arrest. This policy created an impossible situation for millions of men. Many had been captured not by choice, but because they had been encircled, wounded, or rendered unconscious. They had no means of resistance. They surrendered under conditions where the alternative was immediate death. Yet, under Soviet law and military doctrine, as it existed from August 1941, they were officially classified as having failed in their duty. When these men returned to Soviet control, they faced filtration, a screening process run by SMERSH, the Soviet military counterintelligence organization, whose name was a contraction of the Russian phrase meaning death to spies. Every returning prisoner was interrogated. Every account of capture was scrutinized. Men were asked to account for every day of their captivity, how they had survived, what they had done, who they had spoken to, any indication of collaboration with German authorities, any inability to explain gaps in their account, any association with prisoners who had accepted auxiliary roles. Any of these could result in arrest. A significant number of returning prisoners were sent directly to Soviet labor camps, the Gulag system. Estimates vary, but historians working with Soviet archival records have placed the number of returned prisoners who were sent to the Gulag at somewhere between 6 and 15% of all those who returned, a range that represents hundreds of thousands of men. Others were assigned to punishment battalions, military units used in the most dangerous frontline operations, where survival rates were extremely low. This was understood within the Soviet military as a form of redemption. Men who had been captured could regain their standing by demonstrating willingness to die for the state. The psychological weight of this double burden, survival in German captivity followed by suspicion and punishment from their own government, is documented in the memoirs and testimonies of survivors collected during the post-Soviet period when Russian archives became partially accessible to researchers. The filtration process itself could last weeks or months. Men were held in Soviet-run holding camps while their interrogations were conducted, their backgrounds verified, and their wartime movements traced through whatever documentation existed. For many, there was little documentation. German camps had not exactly maintained careful records of what individual prisoners had done day to day. The absence of a verifiable record was itself treated as suspicious. A man who could not account for himself was a man who might be hiding something. One former prisoner, whose testimony was gathered by Russian historian Viktor Zemskov in the 1990s, described the experience of returning across Soviet lines only to be immediately separated from liberated comrades and placed under armed guard. His description of that moment, crossing from one form of captivity directly into another, captures something that no summary can fully convey. The men who passed through filtration and were cleared faced a different but still heavy burden: social stigma. For decades after the war, in Soviet society, having been a prisoner of war carried an implication of weakness or betrayal. Veterans who had spent time in German camps often did not speak of it publicly. It was not a story that fit the official narrative of the Great Patriotic War, a narrative built around heroic resistance and ultimate victory, with little room for the experience of men who had been captured and survived under conditions of extreme degradation. The full accounting of what happened to Soviet prisoners, at German hands and then at Soviet hands, took decades to emerge. And when it did, what researchers found in the archives challenged assumptions that had persisted for nearly half a century. When Soviet archives became accessible to outside researchers in the late 1980s and early 1990s, following the political changes that accompanied the end of the Cold War, historians gained access to materials that had been classified for decades. German wartime records had been studied extensively since the Nuremberg trials. Soviet records had not. What emerged from the combined study of both sets of documentation was a clearer picture of the full scale of what had happened to Soviet prisoners of war. The total number of Soviet soldiers taken prisoner by Germany during the Second World War is estimated at approximately 5.7 million. Of those, roughly 3.3 million, approximately 57%, did not survive German captivity. They died of starvation, disease, exposure, execution, or some combination of these causes. For comparison, the death rate among British and American prisoners held by Germany was approximately 4%. The death rate among French prisoners was approximately 3.5%. The gap between those figures and the 57% death rate among Soviet prisoners is not explained by the difficulties of war. It is explained by deliberate policy. German court proceedings after the war, both at Nuremberg and in subsequent trials, examined the treatment of Soviet prisoners in detail. Testimony from German officers, administrative records, camp reports, and the accounts of survivors established the systematic nature of what had occurred. The verdicts in those proceedings acknowledged that the treatment of Soviet prisoners constituted a war crime of enormous scale, but the legal proceedings captured only a portion of the full picture. Many of the individuals most directly responsible for camp conditions and prisoner deaths were never brought to trial. The administrative chain that had established the framework, the orders issued before the invasion, the decisions made at the level of army groups and army commands, was distributed across so many individuals and offices that accountability was partial at best. Soviet deaths in captivity also raise a question that historians have continued to examine. At what point does the death toll resulting from policy decisions constitute something beyond war crimes and enter the category of deliberate mass killing? The debate around that question involves careful distinctions between intent and outcome, between orders to execute and orders that produced mass death through neglect. It is a debate that has not been fully resolved, and it continues among scholars of the Second World War. What is not debated is the scale. The approximately 3.3 million Soviet prisoners who died in German captivity represent one of the largest losses of human life resulting from prisoner treatment in the history of modern conflict. It sits alongside the Holocaust, which was happening simultaneously with overlapping institutions and personnel, as part of the broader catastrophe of Nazi policy in the East. The experience of Soviet prisoners of war left a mark that extended far beyond the individuals who lived or died in the camps. It shaped the post-war relationship between the Soviet Union and Germany. It influenced Soviet military doctrine and the culture of the Red Army for decades. And it created a silence in Soviet public life, in family histories, in the accounts soldiers told about the war, that persisted for generations. The men who survived German captivity and returned to the Soviet Union often found that the most practical strategy was to say as little as possible about what they had experienced. The stigma attached to having been a prisoner made honesty dangerous. It was safer to speak vaguely, to skip over years, to let gaps in the war record remain unexplained. This silence meant that the full human dimension of what Soviet prisoners endured was not widely understood, even within the Soviet Union, until after the political system that had enforced the silence collapsed. In the 1990s and 2000s, as archives opened and oral history projects began gathering testimonies from surviving veterans, the accounts that emerged were often the first time these men had spoken openly about their experiences. The physical sites of the camps, most of which were located in territories that became part of post-war Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and Russia, were not systematically preserved or memorialized in the Soviet period. The official war narrative focused on battles, on generals, on the eventual triumph of the Red Army. The camps where millions of Soviet soldiers had died received little public attention. In Germany, the process of confronting this history moved slowly. The Nuremberg trials had established legal accountability for some of the crimes committed against Soviet prisoners, but public awareness of the specific scale and character of prisoner deaths lagged behind broader understanding of the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes. It was not until the 1990s and 2000s, with a wave of new historical research drawing on the newly available Soviet archives, that the treatment of Soviet prisoners received sustained scholarly and public attention in Germany. Memorial sites have since been established. Historical commissions have produced detailed studies. The German government has formally acknowledged the criminality of the treatment of Soviet prisoners. Educational programs in German schools now address this chapter of the war, with a degree of specificity that was absent for much of the post-war period. But for the men who died in those open fields, in those pits, in those barracks, acknowledgement came posthumously, decades after the last of them were gone. The story of Soviet prisoners of war in German hands is, at its core, a story about what happens when a government formally removes the legal and moral protections that exist to limit the treatment of human beings in wartime, and what the consequences of that removal look like in practice. The directives issued before Barbarossa began, the Commissar Order, the decision not to apply the Geneva Convention, these were not the acts of individual soldiers losing control in the chaos of combat. They were decisions made deliberately, in advance, by men who understood what they were ordering. The scale of death that followed was the direct result. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.